In this section, we're going to go over the price elasticity of supply and how to measure it. Price elasticity of supply is the responsiveness of the quantity supplied to a change in price. So it's going to be measured very similar to how we did the price elasticity of demand. We're going to measure it by dividing the percentage change in the quantity supplied by the percentage change in the product's price. So again, this is very similar to price elasticity of demand. Here we have the two formulas below. The first, price elasticity of demand, which we talked about before, and on the bottom, the price elasticity of supply. And that is the percentage change in the quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price. We'll do the same sorts of calculations, same sort of methods, all that. So the price elasticity of supply depends primarily on the ability and the willingness of firms to alter the quantity that they produce as price changes. The time period in question is critically important in order to determine the price elasticity of supply. Let's look at a brief example to illustrate this. Suppose the wholesale price of grapes doubled overnight. Farmers could do little to increase their quantity immediately, so the initial price elasticity of supply would be close to zero. They can't just immediately plant new grape plants and then harvest them that day in order to provide more to the market. So they're not responsive to a change in price in the immediate short term. However, over time, farmers could plant more fields with grapes. So over the course of 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, however long the harvests are, the price elasticity of supply would rise. So over the long run, the price elasticity of supply is much higher than in the short run, where it's not very responsive to a change in price. Now let's return to the oil example from the previous section. But why are oil prices so unstable? Oil producers cannot change their output very quickly. It takes a lot of time and a lot of money in order to find new oil fields that they can, drill the oil from. It takes a long process to actually drill the oil, take it out, refine it. So they cannot respond to changes in demand very quickly. So if demand suddenly increases, prices are going to rise, acting as a rationing mechanism for the increased demand. While they will be able to increase the supply a little bit, they can refine faster, maybe draw more oil out of a particular well or out of an oil field that they have quickly than they planned on doing. There's only so much they can do in the short run. Now let's look at the opposite scenario, during a recession when demand sharply falls for oil. So we see here on the figure on the right, the demand curve shifting to the left as consumers are demanding less oil. The price is going to drop substantially, but the quantity supplied, will not drop substantially. That's because oil producers are unable to adjust their output quickly. They're going to keep producing quite a bit of oil. So you're going to have a lot more on the market, and that's going to put downward pressure on price. Again, price elasticity of supply has some extreme cases, so let's look at these. The supply curve is a vertical line. We call that perfectly inelastic. When the price elasticity of supply is perfectly inelastic, the quantity supplied is completely unresponsive to price. So no matter what changes we have in price, you're not going to see the firms produce more. In this case, the price elasticity of supply equals the number 0. So for an example, say you're going to a DC Defenders XFL football game. There are a fixed number of seats for that because the stadium is the size the stadium is. You cannot change that in the short run. So the price elasticity of supply is perfectly inelastic. It will not change no matter what the price of the tickets are. On the other hand, you have perfectly elastic supply. So that's if the supply curve is a horizontal line. In this case, the supply is infinitely responsive to price. So the price elasticity of supply is going to equal infinity. For example, this is the long-run production of agricultural products. This is approximately perfectly elastic. At prices above what the cost of production of those crops are, farmers will supply as much as demanded. This table gives a brief summary of the different levels of elasticity of supply. So the first is if the price elasticity of supply is considered elastic, or if it's greater than 1. In that case, an 11% increase in the price causes a greater than 11% increase in the quantity supplied. So if there's a change in price, the change in the quantity supplied is going to be greater than that change in price. On the other hand, we have inelastic price elasticity of supply. That's if the price elasticity of supply is less than 1. So an 11% increase in price is going to be associated with less than an 11% increase in the quantity supplied, which is shown at the figure on the right. So if there's a change in price, the change in the quantity supplied is going to be smaller than that change in price. The next possibility is unit elastic. So that's if the absolute value of the price elasticity of supply is equal to exactly 1. So the figure on the right shows that there's an 11% increase in price. There's going to be an 11% increase in the quantity supplied. So there's a 1-for-1 change. Again, this is very rare for it to equal exactly 1. The next is perfectly elastic. And in this case, the price elasticity of supply is equal to infinity. So any increase in the price is going to cause the change in quantity supplied to become infinite. So it's a horizontal supply curve. The final level is a perfectly elastic price elasticity of supply. In that case, the price elasticity of supply is equal to 0. So if there's an increase in price or decrease in price, it doesn't matter. There's going to be no change in the quantity supplied. So we're going to have a vertical supply curve. So now, how can price elasticity supply, how can understanding this concept be actually useful for us, especially out in the real world? If you're like, say, running a business or working on pricing or how much to actually produce. Knowing the price elasticity of supply can help people predict the effect that a change in demand is going to have. So when demand increases, we know that the equilibrium price and the quantity are going to increase. But if the supply is inelastic, the quantity supplied cannot change much in response to the quantity demanded, so the price is going to rise a lot. On the other hand, if supply is elastic, if it's easy for firms to adjust the quantity of goods that they're supplying to the market, the price will rise much less. This is hopefully very intuitive, and the next 2 slides are going to illustrate these statements. Now let's look at what happens in a market when there's an inelastic supply and there's a shift in the demand curve. So in this figure on the right, the demand typical represents a typical demand for parking spaces on a summer weekend at a beach resort. The demand curve to the left, demand July 4th, represents the demand on the 4th of July. So now obviously the supply of parking spots at a beach resort is going to be fairly inelastic. It's going to be difficult for them to add a lot of parking spots in a short amount of time, so it won't be very responsive to a change in demand. July 4th is a big holiday weekend, a big weekend people like to go on vacation, so the demand curve is going to shift to the right. It's going to increase for that weekend. Because the supply is inelastic and we're not able to add a lot of parking spots when demand shifts out like that, we're going to see a small increase in the quantity supplied. And that's going to end up causing a large increase in price as the resorts or the people that own the parking, they're going to have to increase prices in order to ration them. Now let's look at what happens when the supply is more elastic. So let's say there's a large open field next to a venue. There's a sudden increase in demand on July 4th, but there's a giant field that's perfect for parking cars in. If that's the case, a large increase in demand that's accompanying the July 4th weekend will not cause price to increase by that much because it's easy for firms to offer more of the product, in this case, more parking. So what we see is the quantity of spaces being offered increases substantially, and the price increase is very small. The price increase is very small because firms are able to meet the increase in demand. They're able to increase their supply, so there's much less rationing that has to occur.